All right. Um, okay. So, uh, quick story. I have with me here, Jeremy, Johnson. Um, how do you describe yourself?
Um, hey Tada, I guess I would call myself a writer, a scholar. Um, we'll just go with that. Integral philosopher, maybe to be fancy.
Okay, yeah, I like integral philosopher. I've never had one on my podcast. Actually, no, maybe I have. Is Ryan a
Yeah,
integral
I would call Ryan an
philosopher?
integral philosopher. Yeah,
Oh,
I would get
okay.
him.
Right, right. Okay, so you're the second integral philosopher I've had on the show. Sounds very cool. Um, yeah. So we were chatting about stuff. Um, but yeah, do you feel like I don't know, catching people up on what we've been chatting about?
Kind of like I mean, in the context of your work with like somatics, and then your interest in what I've been up to in our mutual circles, and then Gebser's work, and then kind of seeing like Gebser is one of these folks who seems to be talking about things like embodiment and concretization and becoming present and kind of moving away from aloofness and abstraction, but not really offering any direct tools or techniques to do that. So you seem to be coming from that place, but not really giving the steps to get there or giving the practices that help enable that in a direct way. And the funny thing about this when we first started talking was so many, and just sort of noting how you met me or how you connected with me, all the folks are in some way working with some kind of contemplative practice, some embodied practices, some healing modalities and somatics, and they're
Mm-hmm.
kind of pointing towards Gebser and this version of integral. And I consider myself more of the like that, like Gebser, kind of the heady intellectual,
Mm-hmm.
slightly poetic, like having that aesthetic disposition myself, but still kind of expressing it intellectually. So just sort of the funniness of those tensions all kind of showing up together.
Yeah, and to be clear, when we're talking Gebser, it's like Gene Gebser, so it's
That's right. Yeah.
Jean
Yeah.
space.
Gene
I
Gebser.
don't, he's not as famous as like Kurt Cobain, right? So I think we need to
Right.
spell it out a bit. Gebser, and actually, do we want to even like? I would think it's even really grounding. People know me, but I think when we talked a little bit about your ancestry, I feel like that's
Yeah.
like just
Yeah.
always like a nice spirit to invite that really grounds kind of the conversation. If you're watching just or sorry, if you're listening to the recording, I can tell you that Jeremy has beautiful flowing hair. Just to give you a little bit of like who's talking. I don't know. I think it's all part of it, but
Visual image.
but yeah. But yeah, I feel like to maybe offer us just a little bit about like your biography, because I feel like that's also like something I'm really interested in, how a person comes to the work that they do, and the ideas that they do.
That was my wife.
Yeah, hi. Yeah.
um, yeah. So for folks who are just listening, my wife just passed by on the camera.
Yeah.
But yeah, so a little bit of background, a little bit of ancestry, which I do think factors in here. I was actually born in Mexico, so I'm Mexican heritage, and I'm kind of in an interesting in betweenness. In that, in Mexico they call mestizo, right? Sort of being mixed different, European and then Native Mexican
Right.
heritage. But I kind of feel in between in the sense that I was
Mm,
raised and adopted by English Irish father and Sicilian mother.
mm-hmm.
Um, so I've kind of, it's always been in the background for my thinking. It's like, okay, I'm coming from completely different and recently different, just as in like it's only been a few hundred years since colonization process and everything else that happened. So I've always had that as a sort of stopgap to not get too over-identified necessarily with being raised in a very white Eurocentric culture, on Long Island, New York. So that's sort of like my heritage background, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the thing, kind of things I'm interested in, having done a lot of like, what people call ancestral healing work in the body and stuff over the last few years. And I'm not like, I would say definitely like Darren Lorsetta, are like real experts at that. And I'm like I don't even know if I'm a good student. I'm a student. I'm like putting myself down a little bit, but like they have very good maps about that stuff. And but something that I noticed in my experience of working with people on their ancestral healing stuff is that like it's a little stuff like that, like just you having a kind of essentially an indigenous, not so long ago heritage in your blood. Living on Turtle Island, it's like these little small things can actually really um like that your perspective of what you're attracted to and how you interpret information. I think it can actually have a big difference. I have definitely noticed that. It's like kind of like even if the same material in front of them, depending on a person's cultural ancestral memory, they start gravitating towards certain things. Hold on one sec, okay? I just realized my yeah, sorry. So I don't know. I feel like this might come up later, but some of the ways I feel like in which you like talk about like or gravitated to some ideas around uh, consciousness being transparent or like diaphanous, right? Is the language that I feel like you all use. There's a feeling of um, I'd say like indigenous culture aesthetically, like percussion, music, dancing. There's that what happens when a body is able to dance and when it starts to philosophizing is different from a body that like every body um whoa, this is interesting, this is coming up in the moment. So it's like every body in its like latent capacities and how it's composed affects the way in which the body thinks, and a part of that's the ancestral memory and the scaffolding around that. So I think there is really something there.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And even if I wasn't able to articulate conceptually why I felt slightly adjacent to, because part of my background is I've been very involved in integral theory community and the consciousness culture and some leftist activism, which we can go into as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of the line of flight that I saw with Gebser's work and that felt intuitively correct was Gebser seems to be much more uh, present to how these different structures of consciousness are always at play in us in an embodied sense, right? Not as abstract oriented, even though he could be deeply intellectually difficult to read, like wading through a dense swamp or a thicket or a forest of ideas and concepts and difficult words. It's still there's something present behind the thinking that isn't just thinking. Um, but in terms of one other thing maybe to bring in too is definitely my Mexican ancestry, and then also something recent that my wife was she's very interested in genealogy and genetics, and she was able to trace. So on my mother's side, it's indigenous American ancestry, right? And then on the father's side, actually, it's traced to the quote unquote Ivory Coast. So she thinks, and this is very rare for Mexican genetics, to have a father who is probably an African American brought over during the slave trade. So just in terms of my father and mother's lineages, it's like indigenous Native American and then African.
Whoa,
So
right.
it's
That's a pretty serious ancestral body mix of like
yeah.
there's a
And I've
lot of
just
shit
thought
there's
about
a lot of
this
shit going on there.
recently. Like this is something that's
Right.
I've recently been thinking about metabolizing because we just figured
Mm-hmm.
out, how that works. So yeah, so I'm sure
Ooh.
I'm just bringing that in because that must be present.
Yeah. You know what? I'm gonna. Oh, sorry guys for this. I'm gonna bring in a stick of incense because I felt the vibe. So, all right, one sec.
All right.
So, um, I like to offer a stick of incense I don't know. What if you want to do anything over that? It's cool, but I can hold this for the both of us if that feels fine. But I like to light it for, I don't know, all our ancestors, because I'm Japanese, which is indigenous settler mix, actually, Japanese people. So we're mixed race, actually, and I don't know, your folks, the mestizo folks, Ivory Coast and indigenous Turtle Island, and yeah, and you're like white people family. Italian, was it
Yeah,
English,
English,
Italian,
Irish,
and
and Italian. Yeah,
English, Irish?
Sicilian.
Yeah, and where's Gebser from again? They would be
Gebser, he was technically born in modern day Poland, but it was like Germany at the time.
right, right,
So
right.
so kind of that
Kind of
area.
all around. Okay,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. And for anybody's ancestors who are listening to, just offering them a little. Just invite us to even just sit with that for a second, if you're into that kind of thing. Mm. And Jeremy, I know this is like improvised and ad hoc, but um, if you feel okay to invite us to breathe into our belly, and if you're following the podcast and not driving, I invite you to do that. Same. And then invite a little breath, light breath up into the heart. Don't have to fill it up, just a little stimulation. And then another light breath into the mind. And then we can, once all the three centers stimulate, you can feel a little bit of the wavy spine feeling. And you want to notice it not just going up, but it also going down, because it's usually the direction we forget. And I'm just going to say right now that Ryan, Jeremy, so Ryan Nakade and Jeremy and one other person, I forgot their name, had was it Going Down podcast?
Growing
Or
down, yeah.
Growing Down podcast. Yeah. So in the spirit of that, just remembering like you're not trying to always go up and transcend, you're actually trying to come down most of the time, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So by even though it's stimulated you, feel the wave going up, but also really try to feel the wave going back down. So I would say even from a somatic philosophical perspective, it's like coming down from the very abstract, the almost universal, non-contextual, transcendent, back down to the ancestral, very contextual, what informs the relationship on a very aesthetic level. And feeling the kind of pathways between. Yeah. Jeremy, do you want to report anything from your experience in this moment?
Well, I recently was commenting on a Cynthia Bourgeot lesson, one of the more recent ones. She's a spiritual teacher, and she talks about kind of bringing this integral oriented awareness into the heart, right? The opening of the heart being important, and some of her frustration with Gebser and like almost going there in his writing and not quite. But I love it's something that's I'm thinking of right now, because experientially working with a little bit of integral yoga, that has become a central insight, that the heart opens, or something like a awareness behind the heart opens, right? It's not going up, it's like it comes in and through and around and through the heart.
Right.
I,
Well,
I don't have the appropriate language for that, but that's how it feels.
Well, I invite you to drop it even further then, right into the guts of things, into like the, like if you want to go really grody, your intestines, your genitals, your anus, like just like drop the, see what happens. If you drop it right even in there. I don't know if I'm getting you to do something that's good for you right now, but but I don't know. How does that feel? Like dropping that sensibility right into the guts.
Very energizing. Like
Yeah.
I want to go. I've been doing this recently, going for hikes, going for walks, and just like walking for a few miles in different state parks. So part of me is just like already moving and sensing, and I can hear like bird song and non-human sounds kind of popping up as I go there.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, should we sit there for a second? My podcast is very like practice oriented, so there's like sometimes like 2 minutes of silence while I'm talking. Like we're just in silence. But
yeah.
Oh wow, really? Huh? Yeah, and I just want to offer. I think partially maybe what we've been talking about. So is like kind of how me and Jeremy even meeting, like us meeting, is like we're kind of coming from like two different worlds in some sense of my life has really been like because of kind of being canceled through the left and industrial complexes that surround that and kind of separating myself slowly. I feel like I've been traveling on, if you ever watched the TV show Lost, so I've been on the island and like marooned with a community of people, I feel like, and we're hacking away trying to figure out what's happening on this island where nobody else is supposedly on. And like when I was talking to Ryan, I also mentioned it, but I feel like, that's like meeting you folk have been like meeting the others on the island. You're like, oh, you're like the other people that were marooned here, and we don't. Are you friend or foe? Like, you know what I mean? Like, even I don't think I'm worried about that as much, but it's just like this, like encountering people who, I guess I feel a lot of people who are adjacent to a lot of communities are now starting to emerge into another network or something like that. There is something I feel like happening. So I just wanted to offer that as like something that rises in my body from my kind of like pelvis, be like to say that. And from a very, let's see. Yeah. What would you have to report, you think, from your body? And especially including like kind of like the abdomen and that, like what would you say you have to report?
Yeah. There's a way in which it feels very similar to so part of this is a discussion between I had Debashish Banerjee on, who's more of an Aurobindian integral yoga scholar last year. He came on the Gebser class to kind of compare notes. And he talks about, and Gebser talks about this too in terms of embodiment, like where there's the head, the heart, the gut, and then there's this sort of vertex that Gebser says, like, okay, that's the locus of the interval, but it's sort of like above the head, but it's also like kind of spherical.
Oh, it's like a torus.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, he doesn't use that word, but I thought of that as like a description because it kind of brings you back down to all the other centers.
Wait, so did Gebser talk about this?
Yes, very cryptically.
Very cryptic. Okay, so let's sort this out. I'm realizing one of the things that was like we need the audience to come along with us a little bit. So, but I think it's really helpful. So I'm thinking the analogy is like, okay, the kick drum, the snare, and the hi-hat, they're all different frequencies, right? All different boom, cats, cats. Like that's how most, and there's congas and all that shit. But let's just keep it simple. Can we talk, like, can you give us a rundown? I know this, you've probably done this a million times, you're probably like, Tada, but like, the structures of consciousness and like very cleanly, like this is the sound of the boom 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 bass drum kick. This is the sound of the snare. Dun 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 dun. This is a hi-hat. Are you able to offer that? Because I feel like that would bring something together in this conversation, and we can come back to this piece. How's that sound?
Yeah. That's good. So with Gebser, I mean, he's the guy who coined an integral theory. Wilbur uses this too, but the archaic, the magic, the mythic, the mental, as these different structures of consciousness. Each of them have their own senseful way of being in the world, right? Their relationship with time and body and world, all different, right. And they're all complementary with each other.
So it's archaic, magic, mythic, and
mental as the first four. And what's interesting is the archaic is really difficult. It's like the root. It's like complete identity of self and world. There's no differentiation necessarily. So the roots of the world, right? If you would go and trace it that way.
Okay. Yeah. There's something happening here. I like it. Can you feel it? I can feel it. I can feel the vibe. Okay. The archaic.
Then the magic though is the gut, like we were exploring just now, like bringing it down into the gut, and what does that feel like? And like the gut being a labyrinth, Gebser describes it as very much labyrinthine, acoustic, auditory. Everything is resonating with everything else. And just imagine being in kind of like an echo chamber or a cave or an acoustic performance chamber. Everything's echoing and resonating. Everything is interrelated with everything else.
He's really describing this aesthetically. Actually, it sounds like, at least your interpretation of his interpretation is like actually very aesthetic. It's like because the way he's describing it's very like audit, like it's a sensibility. That's really interesting. Okay.
And there's like associations like gut, acoustics, resonance, all at onceness, right? And then the mythic is the heart, but it's also like the seat of emotions and images. So he would say like the deeply the psychic imagery, like that arises in dream, right? That arises in the imagination. That is this suffused with the sense, not just of like a meaning, but an emotion, an affect, right? The symbolic language, the symbolic world, right? And all those three are just always ever present online, right? The mental is I mean obviously, but associated with the head, right? With like the top of or like the forehead area, or between the eyes and with the organ of the eyes, right? The perspectival gaze, like looking at subject-object relationship.
Subject-object, yeah.
Transform. I love how he uses this language. This might be an aside, but he says like the mental is able to take that magical, vital aliveness and those mythical potencies, images, and transform them into concepts. It's like a magical act in itself of transmuting these principles of aliveness into concepts and abstraction, right? So that's more of that, and it's more aloof. It's more head oriented, but it uses an organ, right? He says like it's associated with the eye, like the magic's associated with the gut and the mythical with the heart. So all of these centers, particularly those three, like the gut and the heart, and the head, are associated with these structures, and they all play out. They all have a different relationship with time. I should probably mention that.
Yeah, can we? Because like this is what I'm saying. Like, because the bass is like the bass. Nobody plays the bass like boom, 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 boom. It's like the bass drum is the least often, but you need it, or else it doesn't feel like music. But like it's the least played, and the hi-hat is actually the most played, but kind of very high and almost inaudible in a way. And then the snare is the one that you're like. I like to hear about the time thing because this is the I think this is the magic that we're doing. I feel like just exploring this. So different times, like sense of times. Yeah.
I mean, and again, it's a little like my distinction with Gebser is that
Mm.
it's difficult to separate the magic and the mythic when it comes to temporics, because he says first of all, the archaic is like timeless, originary.
Like primordial.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
magic is where things start to happen, but even that, he says, it's like it's a
Yeah.
now. It's that acoustic now in which everything's resonating in the now, right?
Yeah.
So it's its
Well,
own kind of
okay.
like all of time in the now, you know.
It feels like Gebser sounds like somebody who's like a haiku poet or something, actually, when I'm listening to this. In the sense
I
of that's the sensibility of like I'm present now in this art moment of, non-subject object, like that sensibility is very like haiku like.
he was a poet before he was really a
Mm.
scholar of any of this stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
I think he would be happy to be a poet
Yeah.
in this context.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, and then
That's
the
interesting.
mythic though is
Mm-hmm.
like more of a rhythmicity. So then we get into music as well, right? In terms of, but there's like a polyrhythmicity of the body cycles and seasons in step with the rest of nature, in step with like the lunar calendar, for instance, or waking and dreaming, or in breath and out breath, or the heartbeat. And then
A heartbeat's big, yeah.
Brant Stickley talks about this all the time. There's all of these different temporalities and rhythmicities that constitute us in the moment, right? So that's really the heart of the mythic, is this sort of rhythmicity. So like just sort of bringing those two together, the magic is this sort of acoustic resonance, which is much more now oriented, but then the mythic is this rhythmicity. And see how they kind of fold into each other, or like it's really hard to completely distinguish them, because
Right.
there's, time is rhythmic, just in terms of how we experience that, especially music.
Yeah, I have some interesting thoughts on that. We'll come back to it. I'm gonna take some notes. I love it.
But the mental is interesting in that what it does to time is what it does to everything else. It spatializes and abstracts. So time in the mental is very directive oriented, goal oriented, purposive. It divides time. It divides the experience of time into abstract concepts like days, hours, minutes. They're not the rhythmic beat, which you could say divides time in its own way, in a kind of a living way, right? The mental is like the sheet paper, or the clocks or the calendars that aren't really paying attention to rhythmicity or different qualities of time necessarily. It's categorical, it's spatial, it's abstract. But interestingly enough, and this is the only quality that the mental time seems to keep with it, a sense of going higher, a sense of going further, a sense of forward direction, which intensifies, culturally speaking, when we get into, the last 2 centuries, it's become a kind of anxiety about time. So those are the kind of...
Do you want to extend that a little bit more, actually? Anxiety about time, like what you're seeing?
I think for my understanding of that is that the sense of not being able to slow down, the sense of the pace of life, right? The modern pace of life in our neoliberal capitalist lifestyle or cultural attitude is like we always must be going forward, but also this sense that we couldn't slow down even if we wanted to now. And then this other sense of, well, where are we headed? Like, do we really want to keep marching forward, right? So there's this kind of arrest or fixation and an elation with it, in that, like, at least in the 20th century, it was, yeah, things are blowing up, but also all of these innovations are happening. All of these new powers in mastering the world are being unlocked. But the flip side of that is, and we have no control over it anymore. So we're kind of being taken for a ride with this intensity of time kind of leaping, marching forward faster and faster. As Gebser says, we kind of oscillate wildly between anxiety and delight in terms of this intensification of time. So those are the archaic through the mental. The integral is a little different, but I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, let's get into the full drum kit. I feel like because you know what I think. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a little bit of what I've been vibing on now, listening to you. Um, so there's a concept in Asian somatics is called connecting heaven through earth, or connecting heaven to earth. That is like the human's main purpose for existence, essentially. Um, and that's like written like heaven, earth, person. If you roughly translate that to the body, heaven is in your head. It's high. So, and it's also in the space kind of that it opens above, right? But the portal to heaven is through your head. And then there's the heart, which is the person. So person to person, mammalian existence. And then the earth is like, I think our interpretation of earth is probably a bit like problematic though. We tend to think of earth as the earth that we're on. I think it actually probably translates a little bit more into material. It's material. But that goes through the guts and then to the earth below, which is the closest material thing that's very big. Oh, interesting thing. Have a yawn. Oh. Oh. I don't know. Sometimes I get body responses that I don't really know what they're about. So I feel self-conscious, but I allow myself to have them. If you have anything that's coming up, I invite you to.
So for me, I just feel like stretching my back because I've been leaning forward.
Oh, yeah. All right. Yeah, open that back front body. Feel the back body. But yeah, man, like, so there's this connecting heaven through earth thing. And then the three centers correspond, right? Like head, heart, hara, right? A head, heart, gut, however you want to put it. And then there's the, ooh. Yeah. So something's telling me slow down. Don't rush, Tada. So we can even try it right now, like, and just imagining like the three centers because you already stimulated them, right?
Right.
And then you open up the top of your crown, and then open up your root, so your perineum, and then create a toroid shape. So there's a sphere in which our crown, it actually loops back through our environment like a torus and then comes back into our root. I don't know how to, it's like a strange shape, but yeah, how does that sit with you, Jeremy? I'm curious.
It's nice because identifying these centers in my class has been both very simple in that, like, head, heart, gut. Okay, work with the head, heart, gut. Well, how do we do that? Sometimes it might just be a matter of using a visualization like this and actually feeling into those centers and feeling them connected, and that image of the torus actually opening up, becoming a sphere. It's just a simple practice that makes me think of what Gebser talks about with, like, becoming present and then allowing the present to, how exactly to put it, he talks a lot about, like, the body becoming the center of intensification, origin of the spiritual.
Yeah.
But the only way to do that is to, like, really open it all up and really be present to it, and then see in that process how things need to be restructured, what shows up, what arises. Easier said than done, but in day-to-day life, maybe it is as simple as doing this, at the very least.
Right. I mean, I have a slightly nauseous feeling in my guts, and kind of like part of me is like, most people can't do this. That's part of the conversation. But um, I'm just gonna drop the a more abstract thought that I had. I'm just gonna let it say it and let it land because I've been kind of holding back from it. But so this is interesting because it's something I've been really feeling into, because it sounds like there's archaic, magical, mythical, and then mental, but there's actually another guy above the mental a bit, right? Is like it's kind of even in Gebser's cosmology, because for me, what starts the archaic feels like the whole material cosmos and that you access through the guts. That's kind of how I play the game. And then there's the magical in the guts and the mythical in the heart, and then like the mental in the head. But what's the corresponding space above that's not the archaic?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And for me, I usually map like the immaterial. So the heaven is very immaterial, and then the earth, which just is actually a synonym for material cosmos. So there's the humans have this weird capacity to actually feel our nervous system align the immaterial and the material world together, which are different. To me, they're different densities of information, but that probably gets pretty metaphysical. But the human is a weird being that has this nervous system. We're the only beings, as far as I know, that are able to connect heaven and earth perpendicular to gravity, actually, right? Because we're the only species that like walk around the way we do, right?
Yeah.
So our bodies are special in weird ways, because other creatures, their head and their guts, they're more like horizontal or crooked or like spindly and like zero gravity, or like, you know what I mean? And they're in the water and they're floating around like, but humans are the only beings that really are able to create a posture where they're going straight, like connecting heaven to earth, like and perpendicular to gravity. And I think there's actually quite a big like relationship between that and everything that we're actually talking about. So the structure of our actual body informs our actual capacity to feel these different layers in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah.
And something that I've been feeling into and trying to understand is that like, and the Taurus thing comes from like when you get to the center of the immaterial origin and you get to the center of the material origin, it's kind of like, I don't quite understand this, but like black holes and white holes are the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we're actually, as beings, able to contact the two originations, the material and immaterial, but they're actually the same thing if you go far enough. If you feel it in the moment, you're like, they're actually, that's how I feel that torus shape. To me, it starts to make sense because it's actually loops back around. They're actually they're intimately connected in a way that I don't actually I'm not able to describe in words. Maybe you can, because I feel like maybe you're smarter than me in that way. But that's how I somatically register what you're saying or put together your drum kit almost. And what I was feeling like, so you have like the bass drum, which is like the guts, and then you have the snare, which is like um the heart, and then you have the hi-hat, which is like the mental. It's like three different frequencies literally as well as percussion. And then the archaic to me is like the groove. So it's not something you can hear. It's not actually any individual piece of percussion. Like it's not any individual sound, but it's actually the total effect or feeling state. And then I wonder about like then what is above the mental to be a kind of there's something about notation or something. There's something about abstraction of the rhythm as notation that spreads and that has this spreading effect. It's like a meme, right? I guess is one way to put it. Yeah. That's kind of how I'm feeling about it. Like that's kind of how I'm putting together my percussion musical kit. I don't know. So I'm just gonna put that back to you.
What's interesting with the two origin points, right, is interesting because Gebser talks about the archaic as maximum latency, but then he also describes it as
Maximum latency? I love
as
it.
integrality itself. That the archaic is latently integral, right? It's all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we move into the integral, the vertex or the sphere, that is the archaic expressed diaphanously, openly. So they're the same thing in that sense, as you're saying, but they're different aspects. Like one is a sort of dormancy, and he does this actually very similar with the contemplative traditions, like I think in Dzogchen or in Vajrayana.
Okay.
I'm not exactly sure, so I could be wrong about.
Yeah, me neither.
But he says, okay, so comparing these to states of consciousness, he says the archaic is like deep dreamless sleep, and the integral is like lucidity through dreaming and waking. So it's like seeing through, diaphanously seeing through, or fathoming.
And so the diaphanous is being able to be in it, like kind of that dreamlike, being lucidly dreaming.
Being lucid, dreaming, or waking, regardless of head, heart, or gut. Clarity, there's a presence, a creative presence, a clarity of creative presence that is brought forward in the human or intensified in the human, that is aware of all of these centers or structures or temporics. And it is the creative process that brings them forward itself, right? The create, like let's say it this way. The vertex is almost like the creativity of the whole performance, how everything's coming together and moving and bringing things into being and pulling them away or dissolving them. It's the creativity itself. And the human being somehow is folding that into or realizing that creativity through us, right? So that creative originary presence is realized through the human, through this intensity of clarity, lucidity, openness, diaphaneity, which for me it's like I don't exist in that state all the time, but he has described it as like he takes us from Taoism, of breathing through the heels as a kind of, and I love that because it's very embodied expression.
Breathing through the heels?
Just describing that kind of state of openness.
Right.
So
yeah. Well, so that's the breathing through the heels. And partially I'm like, should I just like text Dare and tell them to come on because because I think this poetry, so the diaphanous state actually sounds really like an embodied state is what Gebser is describing. And I feel like maybe that's a part of why I'm trying to understand what you're talking about, but I'm asking the wrong question because it is actually an embodied state of being that Gebser is describing. It's a contemplative state. Because it's not, it sounds like it's not just about things being transparent. Like that's not really it. That's a conceptual way to frame it. But like this is how I've been understanding things, especially around my work around mimetics and like somatics and how they come together. But, you know, there's this problem that we experience where like our brain, essentially, especially the cognitive part of our brain, because I think there's definitely two parts. There's a perception-oriented aspect of our brain, and then there's the cognitive part. And there's the cognitive part of our brain operates a half a second behind reality. This is just science. Like it's like, so if something happens, the fact that it happened takes about 0.5 seconds for us to realize. So there's a slip in reality there because the thing that our brain registers has already happened half a second ago. So there's literally a time machine in our nervous system, right? And so where am I going here? I think I lost my track a bit. But okay, so in this cognitive awareness, what were we just talking about? Diaphanate. Oh yeah. Okay, so
embodied. more
Yeah,
than
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah, yeah.
transparency. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a subject-object relationship to like. So I think the cognitive part of the brain loves the subject-object relationship.
Mm-hmm.
The perceptive part loves to be in a flow state. So there's two different functions that even the brain does, right? So and there's a time lag between them. So they're actually two different worlds. If you actually really think about it, literally there's two different timelines and worlds within a separated by half a second, and there's all these gradients in between, like infinitely. And you can play with that, so any kind of creative activity that's improvised has to deal with that half a second delay because you're monitoring what you're doing, but that information is going to keep coming back to you half a second. So you can only change your algorithm of the present moment activity. You can't actually influence this your cognitive mind because that's not how it works.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that you're doing is happening half a second before your mind registers that it's doing it. So that doesn't work. But so this brain that's cognitive though can only hold it's like an iPhone in the sense that like it can only hold one orientation at a time. Like so that kind of when we talk about memetics, it means that it can really only hold one meme at a time. And every meme is a kind of perspective. So it can only hold one the brain can only hold one perspective at a time. Right. This is a problem. But the body as a whole, the body mind, which is more that flow state mind. I mean, you can call it, flow state is just a way of saying we're doing reality better. We're doing the present reality better in a flow state because you can do the present reality and shit. Like you can be anxious and you're probably having a really bad time with reality. And then there's your cognitive part going, oh shit, my reality sucks and keeps registering how sucky it is, right? And then there's, when you're in flow state, there's a cognitive part of your mind going like, oh, I really like this flow state. Oh yeah, awesome, awesome. And then the flow state's just like doing itself, right? And so what happens with the body mind, which is the gut is the center of, is one of the body mind and the cognitive mind actually kind of operate separately. But the thing about the body mind is it's able to hold information that's conflicting with each other. Like it doesn't need, because it's not an iPhone, so you can actually multitask. So actually think polyrhythmically, process polycontextually. I feel like you speak about this in terms of perspectives. Do you think as a perspective? What's the language you use around?
Oh, a perspectival.
A perspectival.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, technically, Gebser uses that to describe first of all, the prefix alpha privativum is what he uses in a perspectival, right? So, but he says like that's what he's using there, the a, and he also uses a-rational, a-categorical. He even has one he made up, a-mentional, like dimensions, but a-mentional. So there's and he uses that to describe that sort of, it is a fluidic state, but it's also kind of identifying with what brings forward all of these different states and perspectives, right? And being in between all of them and through all of them. And that's the inner goal, really, is that capacity to be in between and through and fully realizing any one particular one, right? Like in its suchness, like more so than just identifying with that, like identifying with that originary clarity and intensity. So yeah, so a perspectival is that. And he says it's different than perspective in the sense of like it's moving out of that subject-object fixity and hyper-abstraction, and meta-abstraction that just like attempts to get out of. And he makes a warning, like we're going to want to make things more abstract to get out of abstraction. We're going to want to go like meta in order to escape the sort of subject-object relationship, but that's not going to work. So he says it requires this sort of concretization, becoming present, intensified awareness that seems to be able to hold all of it, in this diaphanous way. But yeah, that's what he means. But
yeah. So I guess from where I pick up on that is like, it's interesting. Yeah, no. So like how you might describe, the irrational, aperspectival, is that embodied kind of like, as long as you don't think about something too hard, you can hold a lot of things at once. And this is kind of like the Taoist practices around paradox or koans, even the Zen practice of like, I think I talked about this with Ryan, but it's kind of like in Asian practices, you reach the truth when rationality defies it, or when it defies rationality because there's a paradox, not a contradiction, but a paradox. then you have something else comes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something interesting to me is that like, so the cognitive mind can only hold one orientation at a time. So this is the problem. So when it tries to think about issues, like multiple issues, like try to take different perspectives, all it does is flips back and forth. So you're like on your iPhone, you like, you go from Spotify to iTunes, da, 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 but you won't hear all the sounds on top of each other, or even if you do, you won't be able to deal with it, if that makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so what I've been exploring is, well, that means that the OS in the brain that you're using paradoxically has to be something that is able to integrate your entire experience. So this irrational and it has to be attuned to actually, you have to keep nudging your brain actually towards an OS, a basic OS that will run everything well. And that's, I think, what the philosophy kind of is you keep trying to nudge the brain or in thinking to have like one universal program that can run everything or like hold everything. Because the reality is, when you get into the body, it's all conflicting information. So you actually need a mindset literally to be like, oh, actually the conflict and all this weirdness is actually what we would be into. We actually need, because if your mind goes towards like, I actually need things to be simple in my body, I need things to be rational in my soma, that's a really bad OS for us to work with, right? So there's like real fragmentation and disintegration of the body. And I think that's something I've really been interesting conversation around memes, because our body is polymimetic in the sense that we have a diverse mimetic ecosystem, but our mind is actually not like that. It actually needs a lot of refinement and finessing around how do you deal with this, all these ideas and all these different perspectives, and then it becomes the only reasonable philosophy for the mind to hold is around around irrationality, a perspectivality, a categorization, non-duality, paradox. That's the only reasonable thing to do, which I think is something that I've been.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I
I've
think
been
part
really.
of this is like
Mm-hmm.
in the context of what we're dealing with right now, and um, and particularly in our communities, right? Is this sense of like like there's no way that a conceptual rational system can hold it all together. Like
No, that's what. Yeah, that's what I hate. Like, oh my
yeah,
god, yeah, it's like, and I probably sound like a very rational blah 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 blah, blah person, but like that's the paradox, right? It's the only.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, keep going, keep going. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, yeah.
But then B, like there's nothing like reason has a place. It has a place because we can talk about it. We can sort of describe things in a
Mm-hmm.
somewhat systemic way. But reasoning and rationality has to have a better relationship with the whole process that's actually going on. Like if we
Right.
want to actually work with those complexities of the body and different cognitions and different competing mimetics, it's
Mm-hmm.
not going to fit under one totalizing theory or
Mm-hmm.
totalizing form of thinking. It really requires um, uh,
But it does.
relaxing. It does, but it's not ours.
Right,
Like
right, right,
in that
right,
sense,
right,
like we're
right.
not synthesizing it. Like that
Mm,
intelligence is innate to us, but
mm,
it doesn't look like hyper abstraction. We think it does because we're in terms
hmm,
of Western thinking and so on. We want it to
hmm,
fit under a singular map or a singular rational system that
hmm.
spatializes and categorizes everything.
Right.
But thinking itself is more alive than that, right? The
Right, right,
way
right,
in
right,
which the
right,
whole is ordered is
right.
alive, right? So
Mm-hmm.
our thinking has to be somehow, or that OS has to be somehow much more dynamically alive, like living systems are, right? Like our bodies are.
Hmm.
And that's sort of the interesting aperspectival turn, which is
Mm-hmm.
how can I stop overemphasizing abstraction and have a form of cognition which is much more multimodal, atemporic, aperspectival, and fluidic, and be able to kind of move either back and forth with paradox or from the head to the heart to the gut, and just like be able to creatively work whatever's needed in that particular moment, what is arising in that moment, sort of a
Right.
dynamic intelligence. Um, Easier said than done, but I think this is what we're struggling with right now in terms of this mode of being coming online.
And to really ground it into like really concrete terms, like I feel like for me, I've been looking at, I've been a soldier in the culture wars. I still am kind of, and I'm wondering if that's kind of like what you're referring to, or because for me, like I've recently really come to terms with like my last podcast was about this. I don't know the order things are going to be released, but around how like essentially we've become in our kind of hyper intellectualism, we essentially identified so much with our thoughts that we forgot that thoughts are their own beings. They have their own agenda. So that's the memetics thing, right? And this whole issue that we have is in the culture wars, whether or not, like, yes, I rather talk to any kind of leftist than a white supremacist any given day. Like, that's obvious to me. That's obvious. That's fine. But I think that's true. And this is the diaphanous part, right? Is like, that is true. But also, the other thing is there's something underneath all of that, that all the strategies of, or at least the dominant strategies, is how these conversations are playing out is a kind of mimetic warfare and who gets to monocrop. So it's like a Monsanto essentially, who gets to plant their seed in the ground. And it's like it's singular. So that's a lot of why there's been a lot of stress also in like leftist communities, or people essentially burning out because like they're realizing that like living in a monocropped ecosystem mimetically doesn't is like terrifying, like and even simple examples like I use were like the hashtag of believe survivors, and it's like there's so many different versions of that meme. And some of the uses of the ways people use that is just like, yeah, don't dismiss people when they say that harm has happened. Totally reasonable under trauma theory and all that. Like, and then there's like the most extremes of like, or the most simple in a way, most refined, which is just like, absolutely believe whatever somebody says if they claim that role. And that's a very like fear-based way of interacting with that meme, which is itself actually different memes under one name, actually, if you look at it, because they're different behavior sets. And you see the monocropping, right? There's this for one single thing to want to take over the ecosystem. And I think a lot of that happens because we're using our cognitive brain processes so much, which actually operates as an iPhone. So that's the only app you're running. But the body is accessible to many different apps, and they can all run at the same time even. And so I think this kind of like operating system reconfiguration, even on a like just like a self-reflective level, is like very big. So I'm curious about like, I guess like for me, I feel like I saw a podcast episode of yours that did talk about the culture wars, or quote unquote like was around that subject. So I'm curious
Yeah.
about how that maybe that's what you're swimming into, because that's how I'm feeling. That's what actually attracts me to your communities, because I was like, oh, these folks are not tied so much into this very ideological way of being that I'm so used to. People who are a lot more intellectually playful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like I find a lot of the folks around have that orientation. I didn't know, I didn't even necessarily know you're allowed to be that way in some spaces and still care about things like colonialism, racism, and stuff like that. Like I knew that for myself, but I didn't necessarily know that there are others on the island, and they might not even have like a really super somatic approach that I've been taking. Like, of course, everybody does this. Like, I was really baked in with somatics, very like it was very like almost rigid around that being how I define my practice and how people related to me and how that had to do colonialism. Da, da, da. But I feel like interacting with people who are more intellectually more acrobatic and polyrhythmic, which I so curious. Like, yeah, what you might
Yeah.
how you might respond to all that.
Oh, well, I think part of this is something I wrote about in my book about Gebser, talking about what he says is like some of the symptoms of the perspectival crisis, right? He had different terminology. I mean, obviously we've talked about perspectival and aperspectival, and he says, okay, these constitute, when he's talking about those and not the structures, he's saying that it constitutes a world. So almost like a cultural ecology that we're kind of swimming in. And he says the perspectival world, of course, is predominantly rooted in this mental structure, in its deficient expression. And part of that whole moving into abstraction, as you're saying, right, is like the one application that's open and that's it, right? One totalizing view at a time and that's it. And so he says with the perspectival world, that the very act of gaining perspective in that subject-object relationship cuts us off from the whole. It's the first severing from the heart and from the gut, or from the unperspectival world that he describes. So there's this cutting and severing that's very in the very act of developing perspective. And so he says, like, basically what happens with the perspectival crisis is sort of like it runs amok, in the sense of it's overextended to the point where everybody is doing these little micro totalizing perspectival gazes, which everybody has a totalizing worldview, and nobody has a way to really connect with one another anymore in that sense, because of perspectival severing, right, and atomization. Many different theorists have talked about atomization and the fracturing of cultures, etc. I mean, colonialism is like a great expression of that fracturing of the world, in ironically in a totalizing gaze, right, in terms of imperialism and so on. But even in our own, the technologies we're using today, it seems to have like sublimated that, or even elevated it to the point where each person can become absolutely atomized and isolated, and also totalizing at the same time. And part of that oscillation of the perspectival crisis is this veering towards unhealthy perspectival totalizing, and then in mass, like as you're saying, like with hashtags, like doing that totalizing together, right, online with each other, into these like tribal warfares, right?
I
Like,
love doing the totalizing together online sounds
but
like
it's not a
hell.
healthy, it's not a healthy collectivity. It's a mass collectivity that's like, Gebser says, it's the deficient magic, right? Like a doing without consciousness. But the problem is we've so severed ourselves from the magic and the mythic, and we're so in our heads and abstracted, that we're completely captured by the deficient mode of all of the different structures of consciousness in the context of the perspectival world, which means more atomization, more segmentation, and an unrootedness. Like a lot of folks in our communities talk about the meaning crisis, and I have ambiguous feelings about that.
Hey, do you want to hold on one second? I'm gonna write
Yeah.
down that word. I'm finding, because do you want to connect your mic, because you're actually becoming more animated and alive, and so your hair, your beautiful hair is brushing up against your mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah, let me.
does it take a second to
Yeah,
just?
like 30 seconds.
Okay,
I
okay. I'm just gonna
break
go to the
down.
washroom, so this is perfect. One
Perfect.
sec.
It's like of sim.
Yeah, sorry. So Jeremy's beautiful hair is out. Jeremy's hair is like crazy beautiful. Just saying, y'all. But
His own character in this podcast.
but I was just saying, talking to Jeremy, that like because our conversation's becoming more alive and our spines are moving and the three centers are actually moving, like the mythic and the magical and the mental and even the archaic and maybe the integral, whatever you want to, however you want to, all those things are starting to move. So their hair is starting to smash up against her mic, and I think that's a real thing. It's funny. But so we have uh, um, a microphone on Jeremy now, like a sweet one apparently, and we ended up talking about the meaning crisis. That was kind of where we put the bookmark. If you want to just lift off from there. Oh, damn. Hold on a sec. Yeah, go for it.
I was about to say we seem to have blown up
the internet.
I don't know. Yeah, the energy.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, my internet just went out for a second there. But yeah, well, maybe sit with that. Was there like a peak moment that we somehow hit into? Yeah, I can feel a bit of that energy. Like we actually like peaked at something. Like something reached a new plane.
I would say that's a good illustration of
the energies and intensities that this world, we could say the perspectival world, we could say globalization, modernization, the whole context of everything we're dealing with right now as a planetary civilization, right, under capitalism. The intensities that this world has initiated and unleashed. But I think this is interesting that Gebser says that this has always felt right for me, that the mental structure and the perspectival world can initiate a world transforming consciousness, but it can't master it itself. So it splits the atom, it rips open the world, it severs the connections with the roots and with meaning and with myth and the gut. It tears things open, but it doesn't know what it doesn't have the tools to really do whatever needs to be done next in terms of getting rooted again or getting grounded again, or like bringing forward this originary intensity and actually metabolizing that in the body and becoming integral as human beings. The mental doesn't have the right apparatus to do that. It breaks it apart. As he says, like it bursts spatial system, bursts the mental world, as the mental world in its own myths about itself, like Athena birthing from the head of Zeus was this like event which happened in heaven and on earth and in the underworld. Everybody was shocked by this, right? This rupturing of that mythic participation. The mental sort of does that to itself. It bursts itself open in what it attempts to master. So I don't know. I'm just playing with that as like we seem to have touched on that little intensity in it. Adapt our
right. Exact our internet connection.
Yeah.
No, I can definitely feel that. I mean, I can definitely feel maybe tracking a little bit of. I call it mimetic sex. So it's kind of like when two mimetic dispositions are meeting, they start to either fight or start to make love. So it's kind of the Hegelian dialectic versus, I don't know what the opposite would be, but like there's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? Which is like the process by which knowledge keeps getting updated. There's like a thesis, the status quo, the antithesis that says no to that, and then there's like the after effect of it, right? It's kind of like, cock rock, like Guns N' Roses, and like Nirvana, grunge, and then like the rock field changed after to mean actually a synthesis of alt rock and hard rock. Actually, that's what literally happened, right? And when that happens, both things before die. So that's also an interesting relationship between death and eros. But thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is something that I think I can feel as a part of like maybe even that mimetic moment that we experience. Because, like I said, I feel like we're like two different, like we do come from like two different kind of centers in terms of community. Vacuum.
It's vague and quiet enough.
Oh, okay, good. And so yeah, so I feel like maybe there's a little bit of like maybe we touched in on that kind of like mimetic, orgasmic kind of like something like, because the integral moment as you described might be like kind of that orgasmic moment of everything making sense for this small sliver of a second, and then everything stops making sense again. That's kind of how I feel about the archaic moving into the mythic to the, or sorry, archaic to the magical to the mythic to the mental, and then to like the integral, boom, and then it disappears again, like it, and then you had to start over. Oh yeah, I'm just gonna say that, yeah, I felt that a little bit. And yeah, how do you respond to that? Curiously, we're in a very weird conversation. I mean, I feel the weirdness of our conversation actually, which is kind of funny and pleasant to me.
No, I'm enjoying it. I think for me the pop that occurs, and that it seems very weird, the idea of being able to make an orthogonal move with the integral, that the tensions of perspectival and unperspectable of the gut and the heart and the head doing this dance with each other over history and time and everything that's happened. And then the integral is this sort of flashing forth of the whole, how it all is like one living, alive whole, which is not a rational whole. It's not a mythical complementarity. It's not a magical gut interdependency, but it is all of those things. And so that's the, yeah, it's almost just like one of those like kind of peak experiences where the whole flashes forth, and then what? I don't know. But what Gebser seems to be saying, what I think folks like Aurobindo seem to be saying, is that intensity of being able to play dynamically with these different centers is the default position for the future. That nothing less than that in our humanity is nothing less than that will survive in terms of like the crisis that we're in, or in terms of, and I don't mean the meaning crisis necessarily, just living on the planet as embodied creatures, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Having that sense of the living past.
That was very stupid. I'm sorry, listeners, but yeah, I thought my volume was down. It's all good.
Yeah,
it was my alarm to text you, and we're already talking. Funny. Yeah.
But we're already here.
Yeah, we're already here. Time is slippy.
But yeah, like being able to navigate multiple centers, the aliveness of the past in the present, the aliveness of the future in the present, and then the past, present, and future dynamically interrelated here, dynamically interrelated presently, and forming like Brandt talks about, Brandt Stickley, the acupuncture point of the moment, this moment,
right?
Past, present, and future are all in that singularity. Somehow that form of intelligence and cognition and presence seems to be necessary, and it spills over into the somatics that you're talking about.
Right.
When Gebser was talking about with the different structures that are they're always at play in us, they constitute us as embodied beings, but also like we move into more of like the spiritual themes of, the presence of the ancestors, right? Presence of the ancestors in the present, but also transparent to the present of the unborn, right? So this sense of past, present, and future, the aliveness of the quote unquote older structures of consciousness, and the capacity to continue to use the mental is not going to go away. We need the head in that sense, but as part of this dynamic whole, and somehow the locus of our cultural phenomenology being in that dynamic whole to address some of the questions that we've been talking about, like mimetic warfare, and how our technology seems to be predominantly using and stuck in this perspectival crisis of like deep atomization and then very unhealthy collectivization. There's no rootedness in that at all. So like as a way to address that, how do we do that? What are integral technologies? What are cultural practices that bring us back into the body, but also render like thinking still present, right, and transparent? There's a lot here, right? But the idea is like
there's a ton here.
Seems to be a deeply transformative moment for our species, and I think where we sync up is like that colonization, abstraction, forward directed, cultural attitude is dying. It's really in this process of imploding right now.
So I have so many questions, but first thing I would say starting off is like, Brandt, I don't even know half the shit he's saying all the time, but I know it's right. This is how I describe Brandt Stickley. It's like, I don't know half the shit he's talking, but I know he's saying something that I'm like, it's like when you hear a jazz musician, you don't know what their notes they're playing, but I'm like, I think you're talking reality to me that I don't understand. That acupressure point was interesting because I had a conversation recently with Dare that was about kind of like, because even in doing ancestor work, it's always a trap to think our indigenous ancestors lived perfectly harmoniously or something, like to create these kind of mythical kind of like falsities about the past, because the past led to the present in a way. So it's like, what's up, right? It's all part of like an ongoing evolutionary process, whatever you want to call it. Like we might not like it, Like colonialism is not an unnatural thing. Colonialism is natural to humans. We wouldn't do anything that's not natural to us. Like, I think how we define nature is really weird. But we did talk about there may be points in time in history, various points in various cultures, various times and places where, it's like Satori. It's like this brief moment where everything was good, and then it goes out of balance again. What that means, like the means of production, our relationship to the environment, and the wild, and like the human, how we're handling questions around gender and stuff. There's like this brief moment of like sweetness, and then it disappears, and then it appears again, and then disappears. And what we talked, and when I mentioned that to Dara was kind of like, oh, like cultural acupuncture, which is interesting because Ryan talks about that too. So it's kind of like a recurring theme. So I just wanted to put that out there. And then inside of that, there's this, Dara made a post about, I think we're in the second axial age. Axial mean, I don't know, like critical, or like, I mean, we're being transformative all the time. But it does seem like, are we actually in a very transformative moment? Do you know what I mean? Yeah, like, because sometimes I get caught in like, is it narcissistic to think that we're in some very important human project, and somehow we're doing that on the internet by just kind of commenting on each other's posts? Are we in this amazingly interesting human moment that's super transformative, and we're self-aware of it, and we're clicking about it on the internet, typing on each other's posts, and creating this knowledge together in this weird machine that's also alive and wanting us to do that thing? Actually, part of it wants us to do it, part of it doesn't want us to do it, probably. But like, are we actually in that amazingly transformative moment, or are we just being narcissists? And I don't really know. I've actually been having a lot of like kind of personal crises over that, because I'm kind of like, just being like, oh, we're really talking about humanity's most important pivot in like a few thousand years. Is that really what we're doing right now? Or am I being narcissistic? Am I really like, is this what's actually happening? That's how I think about the communities I'm in or you're in and stuff. Like, I'm curious. And then you said something with the meaning crisis. So I'm also like kind of tracking that too. Cause I'm like, yeah.
Oh man. I think, I mean, I want to say that we are, but I have the same disclaimers about it.
Yeah. You're not drinking your own Kool-Aid, or like, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I would say
some people are. Some people are drinking their own Kool-Aid pretty hard.
There definitely are, and there's a lot of language about that. That we're in a new renaissance, that we are building a new civilization, and like it's a lot of it's meant to be positive and uplifting and inspiring for a moment of crisis, and I understand where they're coming from there. But on the other hand, I don't know where this comes from for me, but I've always got the sense, and I like this about Gebser too, where he says like, okay, this integral world, this integral reality, where that subject-object relationship is changing and the whole is like really kind of coming forward, that is happening of itself. Whether or not we want to make this a positive or constructive transformation for us is up to us, and how successful we're going to be. It's happening of itself with the Earth. Humanity is being initiated into it. Are we the co-initiators of it to some capacity? Like, yes. I think how we were like, it's bigger than us. It's like any kind of, I mean, we're talking about artists and creativity and music. Like, when you feel drawn to make something, like, can you really say like, I forged this thing out of my own imagination? I'm so excited. Like, sometimes, but a lot of the times it's like, I got this thing I need to make, So I would say like, the ambiguity here is how much this has us or we have it. It seems to be both. Like, I want to like at least give us that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think these are the scary thoughts I have, is like that we think we're in humanity's most important age, but we might actually be giving birth to new forms of intelligence that are riding us, essentially. That is their most important age, and we're confusing it. First of all, in the sense that if you are really follow the animist way of understanding memes, then we're already in one of the world's most expansive organisms as we're talking. We're in the internets right now as we're talking, and if we assume the internet has its own desire to propagate whatever it's doing, it's kind of a little bit like, oh yeah, we might be doing its bidding even as we talk. Not all the internet is multiple organisms at once too, so it might not be, it's an ecosystem in and of itself, right? So it's like there's some emergent thing that's happening that's wanting us to connect, and like we don't know these things. It doesn't have to turn into total sci-fi, but I think what I mean is that it's like are we co-initiators though? Is a really good question, because I'm like the initiation to humanity is happening. Like that's undoubted, right? There's something fucking with us, and it might be nothing, but all that nothing is also something. It's not like some, like weird Marvel superhero in like probably a brain in a vat controlling us. I don't think that conspiritual reality is not what I'm talking about. But there is a process that we're in that not any individual human being can stop. I think that's very clear. There's movement that we're in, a river of our nervous systems that are all connected together as one body. This is kind of how I see it. Is moving somewhere, and individually, like a cell in my body can't really choose where it's going to go, or it can, but it's kind of like it's subsumed by my desire to go to the corner store. So that's happening. The cultural body is going somewhere, and it's getting more and more intense in a way. And the cultural body itself is also manifesting into a nervous system expression, like the internet is. The internet is like a large nervous system. It's an expression of one, but it is one in and of itself. And so I do think about that kind of moment we're in and the importance of it. I think we maybe become really anthrocentric about it. I think maybe that's a little bit of more I'm catching into the fear of the future a bit, almost like a respect for the future. Mm-hmm. Kind of Dare talks about respect being a kind of fear, and like a good amount of fear. It's like we might think we're in humanity's initiation and awesome moment, but we might actually be being gobbled up into somebody else's dream. Mm-hmm. If that makes right. Do you know what I mean? And we're not talking, I guess I'm talking a little bit like Terminator, but I don't think it's that sci-fi. It's like we're dealing with another organism, really. That's kind of, I think maybe that's really how we have to start seeing it. Like we have to start looking at the information technologies that we're embroiled in that are actually creating more of that atomization, and you're talking fragmentation, right? People are collectively doing the same thing. The internet's one of like the best guiding tools to facilitate that, people doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. In an atomized way. And I think we're going to have to be more and more accepting that, oh shit, this thing is actually alive that we're in. And that's okay. But we need to realize that we're not just in humanity's maybe axial age. We might be in the birth of something else. I don't know if that's a bit crazy. I don't want to become a conspiritualist, but I think it also touches on some of the anxieties that are being spoken to. Curious, kind of.
Isn't that like a Marshall McLuhan quote that we're the sex organs of the machine world? Like the human species is the sex organs of the mechanical and technological world, that we're producing them. But yeah, I think there's a few overarching themes that add coherence to what we've been talking about in this context of technology and the future, and what some folks are calling the post-human or the post-human turn, which is a fancy word in academia to be talking about like non-human agency again, right? And not necessarily in an animist perspective, although there is like warming up to that, but also with technology and also with like the weirdness of objects and object-oriented ontology, and like is there agency in the things and the tools that we use around us? So, interesting turns there, but even more in that ontological sense, like in the life sciences, they're talking, and this is what Barbara Carlson talks about all the time, one of my colleagues, that the microbiome, right? Speaking of other beings that have their own agency, almost like memes, like
this is all doing is this is all this shit that spins together. But go on.
But the agency of the microbiome in our gut and what we eat and how we think and our cognition, etc. The extended agency of the non-human world is part of that turn. And so when we move into the Anthropocene and start talking about Are we in an axial age? It's almost as if that ultimate subject-object distinction between the human and the non-human is really what's being called into question right now. Like, are we becoming non-human again? Is the human really kind of opening back up into the non-human world in a way that we haven't seen, not just in a few thousand years, but in an evolutionary scope of like in relationship with the rest of the planet? Because here we have unleashed all of these technologies, right? And this is what Anthropocene scholars talk about. And now we're kind of, we're, you know, unintentionally becoming a force of nature, just in terms of the climate change crisis,
Oh yeah,
the
absolutely.
fossil fuel crisis, all the ecosystems we're destroying. So suddenly we are like unleashing levels of scale that we have no understanding of. And so,
right.
So
But
this non-human turn seems to be very post-human in that sense.
Right, and I think part of the things I struggle with is when we talk about that post-humanness, like I think about it and also like I see like there's a part of me that's like, yeah, and talking about the microbiome as post-human feels very grounding. It has a very different texture in my body than talking about post-human and the post-human, you know what I mean? It's a very different somatic sensibility. So I can almost feel the, if I want to get really future casting weird right now, is kind of like I would say the kind of fragmentation and psychosis that happens when somebody's disconnected from their microbiome and their body, essentially. I can see like conspirituality is that to me, is a kind of and when I say psychosis here, I'm not giving it a judgment value, just to be clear. I'm just talking about a phenomenon. And then in some cases, psychosis and I mean that in a very like broad way, like is not so hot. Like, you know, like if you're experiencing psychosis as an individual experience that is transformative, that's one thing. And I think, well, what am I getting into here? I think I'm getting myself into trouble. I think psychosis is a weird weird word for a somatic process that we go through, and we need different technologies that are to manage it. Let's put it this way. But in like a conspiritual sense, where you're in this hallucinatory, psychotic kind of vision of the future that's disconnected from the microbiome, is understanding of post-humanist, because they're both post-human. They're both saying that, like when you confront the microbiome and you're like, oh, you actually have beings in your body that are not you, that have genetic information that actually control you. Like literally, if you do something that they don't like, you get sick. Right? So they control you. Essentially, they fucking control you, and you stop listening to them.
Or even like your own desires, your compulsions for particular types of food or moods during the day. Like,
yeah,
whose agency is that? Is it yours or is it theirs? I mean, there's a strange.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's where the horror stuff has always been really. That's where the horror stuff kicked in for me, right? Because it is kind of like we have that post-human weird entity within us. Because when I started really learning about the gut and cultivating that and going like, and then, you know, reading things, because actually gut science is actually pretty, it's like kind of 50 years or something more advanced in Japan. Because you can imagine, because everybody, that's like what they care about. So they've been studying that for a long time and writing about it. And it's like, yeah, like literally they're like, yeah, there's like agency your microbiome has over you. You don't even control yourself. And the more like your perspectival brain gets away from the aperspectival microbiome, you get really, like you just develop more and more ailment. Right? And so I think even just confronting the post-human future from like the perspective, oh, we already actually experienced, it's not a big deal. We already don't have agency over ourselves in most days. We just pretend, and the more we try to pretend, we're getting sick. Versus the kind of, I think, desire for acceleration, the desire for, it's almost like you're afraid of the future, so you're trying to annihilate yourself into it by becoming it really quickly.
Yeah.
And like, there's a part of me wondering, going like, yeah, we're destroying ecosystems, but are we birthing a whole new one that we're going to be just a part of? Like, we are doing that. We are literally birthing, or we are literally portals for a new ecosystem. that is actually kind of what's happening. Ecosystem of information is becoming more and more abstract information is allowed to exist abstractly in the world, if that makes sense. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. I think with this question, there's like a third orthogonal turn here with the aperspectival for me, which would be, and this is a future we should or hopefully will. I hope we do.
I mean, it's I think choose your own adventure, right?
Oh yeah,
choose your own adventure, and
then the post-human AI, whatever, cyberpunky kind of future, which isn't so great. I mean, we could choose that, but I much more like the idea that we're moving back, or it's possible to move into a relationship with the non-human world that's very much similar to the way we did in like the Paleolithic, right? Where the identity between the human and the non-human was very continuous, and the agency was always in question, and it was really a matter of cooperating with the non-human world. Now, I think that's intensifying right now. So the kinds of combinations that come together are both technological and then also cooperative with non-human agencies that are already present in nature. So like I often bring up Neri Oxman's work at MIT, which on the one hand, like her work is terrifying, and on the other hand, it seems to be kind of this integral turn in the sense of she gives one example, and it's more of an aesthetic one to just illustrate what's possible. But she basically creates an architectural structure with silkworms, and she allows the silkworms to help govern the process in which the shape actually unfolds and everything else. So it's like a cooperation with the non-human world, moving away from sort of an industrial model of production and mastery over nature to cooperation with. And it's more than biomimicry, because the line between, she says her Turing test is, was this made or grown? Like, if you're not able to tell, then that's a success.
Wait. Go back. My head scrambled. Like, holy shit. Okay, what's their experiment again? Made or grown? I want to hear that's the Turing test.
The Turing test is, if you can't tell the difference between something that has been manufactured and the human manufactured, or something that's like just grown out of nature and like picked it out of the forest. Like,
and what does she do with the silkworms again? I'm just trying to like, I feel like
basically created a kind of canopy awning with them and allowed them, and like the tensile structure of the silk and the way and the rhythm of the organisms as they grew the silk, right, and spun it to govern the shape and the structure. And so, but she created like a graft for them to grow with it, right? And she used computer modeling, not to create like a model of the completed product, but actually to help with the dynamic process of working with the silkworm. So it was this bizarre, like, it's grown, it's made, it's working with the non-human agency of the silkworms, and it's also like applying those principles of like process-oriented thinking to the actual development process itself. So her thing is like, can we grow buildings rather than make them? Can we move to this growing model rather than an industrial productive Cartesian model? So I'm using that as one example, as like the weird ontologies of the future, which blur human and non-human. But they're not that weird, as you're saying. Like we've always existed in this, and only very recently have we abstracted ourselves from having some kind of active conversation with the non-human, right? Informing us.
Well, I think partially we over-identify with the non-human in the sense of, because I see our entire being as a mimetic complex. Like all our sensations, emotions, and thoughts are pieces of information. And none of those things are essentially ourselves in a way. In some ways, we are a being that arranges information in a way that looks like a self to another person, or even to ourselves. But the essential self might be more like simply what you might call like a center of gravity. Like the earth has a center of gravity, I have one. And then my cells organize information around it. My energy body, what do you want to call it, organizes information around this. The center of gravity. And there's something about what has happened, I think. A lot of the problems that we experience, right, is because the ancients and elders understood that information is real, in the sense that that's the work of a shaman, is to manage the information within a community. like a shaman or a witch doctor. That's their role. The people who manipulate information are the people who govern communities or have the capacity to. And that hasn't changed, but there's less transparency about it. And there's also the reality that, you're talking about the co-initiation thing. People don't know if they're being, they think they're manipulating information when reality is information is manipulating them, because they're not able to separate in their own system the difference between themselves and the information bodies that they're made up of. And that's what I mean when, and that's like kind of where the gut becomes a complex place, because there's all this information genetically that's not even ours that we're dealing with. And I think that creates a really different scaffolding of understanding things. And then my question then it goes towards like what you're talking about, the future. It's a choose your own adventure. And the problems I see is that those adventures are not isolated from each other. So the adventure you're talking about, like living in a silkworm dome, sounds really awesome. That's choose your own adventure, right? But those are not the only adventures around. The other adventure could be like this really, like people being exposed to intense AI and intense kind of like mimetic technologies and seeing them like, holy shit, what happened? And not having a sense of their body, not being connected to their ancestors, and being exposed to that intensity of future can really project you into this kind of psychosis state where, and a lot of those people who would access those psychotic states are probably have more privilege and power as well, right? They have like people, because the more privilege you have in a society, you tend to be more dissociated actually from your body. If you actually look at how our society is created, right? The people who run our governments and stuff like that, they're like the most dissociated people around. That's how it works, right? It's like literally the scaffolding of the head being dissociated from the rest of the body. That's kind of how our culture is run. Like you have every, almost every leader of an organization is dissociated from what's happening within the organization. This is kind of how it works. And so those people being exposed to that intense of a future, I think is really quite, it's actually quite, we're going to have problems to deal with, I think, in ways that we don't imagine, maybe even because it is choose your own adventure. And again, like our silkworm dome, where we're like typing on in the mutations Facebook group, there still might be people else. The other adventure might be to become like this like conspiritual roaming tribe of white supremacists. I have no idea. Like that is very real, because that's how intense the future is becoming. And I think people already experience that. People go on, like people are doing ayahuasca trips and they come back and they're like, because I think that even the QAnon or whatever thing is, there's a psychedelic renaissance, there's a pandemic, and everybody's hooked into the internet. So people are doing psychedelics at home, hooked into the internet, like, right? That's like the atomization, and like that's the scaffolding. So I think we're in a really like, maybe it's not axial, maybe it's like kind of like a really like time. You know what I'm saying? Oh well, your mic is off.
Sorry. I think part of the problem is the combination, or as Gebser says, we live in a Janus phase time where like the new hasn't fully consolidated enough, and the old is sort of capturing every little new innovate, like the internet, this fantastically distributed technology which brings the invisible and the immaterial and the conceptual into the world, is captured by neoliberal extractive capitalism, right? So the algorithms really drive atomization. People are using the internet not coming from that silkworm future, but they're using it as deeply atomized and dissociated individuals that are searching for meaning and fulfillment, and they're grappling on to like QAnon or something along those lines. Like, yeah, so we're in this weird Janus phase period where I would say that defines axial ages in the sense of they are deeply destabilizing, and there's a kind of collapsology going on in terms of like a total undermining of a particular worldview, sense making, etc., and then also the reconstituting of a new one. But like that messy period doesn't necessitate that we're going to get through. It's like really tenuous in the middle of everything. So that's how I kind of understand those kinds of restructurations. Like the mutational periods from one structure of consciousness to another are very tenuous, and it's very difficult to even cohere like what is the new and what is the old, because they very often will show up as Janus faced in both, like the internet, like technology, like the post-human seems to be like it could continue that neoliberal atomizing, abstracting trajectory into total dissolution of the
Yeah,
human, and we're very much still on that course. I would say that's still the momentum. This
Right. So
future
you're pretty
as,
real
like,
with yourself about that.
yeah, I would say
Huh.
the severity of this is we have
Huh.
wrought the integral age first as crisis and catastrophe. Like integrality is going to show up, like we were saying earlier. Like the integral world as a reality, as an intensity, is already showing up, and we can make it show up through a crisis and a catastrophe, or we could try to do something different. But I feel like we've sort of set it up so that it is showing up as crisis and catastrophe very often first. But I think there's a silver lining in that we can learn from crisis, and we very often have, just in the history of our species, in these pivotal moments where things are falling apart. I think part of the ground falling out from underneath us is part of what motivates us to actually try different alternatives, right? To go into different lines of flight. So that's my small hope, but it's a kind of realistic hope that like crisis is a learning opportunity. For the first time, people might be open to listening to something different and reassessing some of the underlying assumptions that they have. Whether that will be enough, I hope. Like previous axial ages or previous critical juncture points, I feel like ours is sort of condensed temporally. That I don't know what we do in these few generations seems to be, and I don't want to make that sound hubristic. It's like it's actually too much for a generation to really consider. You know what I mean? And yet it seems to be like thrown on us with that intensity.
Right.
So not to be a downer, but like
no.
It's that intensity that I think we need to be real with.
Like we're actually looking into that intensity kind of in the eye. It's kind of like it feels like what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because so I talked to somebody. I don't know if I can mention their name because I didn't talk to them about whether we can talk about this conversation outside of our conversation. But we were talking about initiations, and in axial age is kind of like what you're talking about in the sense like humanity's going through initiation, and I've been long having conversations in my circles around and the difference between informed consent and initiation. And in some ways, because we don't have initiation processes for humans anymore in a way that is like centralized. So you don't have an elder usually you don't have an elder or community that can come to you and be like, hey, you're going to go through initiation processes. And what I understand initiation is you get to meet all the beings that you actually don't have agency over that have like you have co-agency on your life, if that makes sense. And you get to meet them, whether it's through a psychedelic trip or contemplation or something. And that is kind of like a death realm you're meeting. And the initiation process is here's the information about what's really happening. And also you need to be a good person. You need to hold this well. That's kind of like what an initiation process means to me. And a lot of that thinking, is something that I've thought, talked a lot to about Dare and Dare's shifting their work. I think Larissa too, over their work too, looking at like, oh, I'm here to support your initiatory process. Now, where I think this comes in is that like, I think we're in generally speaking, because when you lose initiation as a process that's culturally embedded with kind of, and there's pros and cons for there to be authority and initiation, right? Because then you have somebody who can control you in a certain kind of way, right? But then they give you a lineage and ancestry. So it's kind of a catch-22 in some ways. So if you ask somebody who's kind of shitty to you to initiate you, well, your life's going to be really fucked up, right? So there's some like things about some goodness maybe to not having a centralized process, But what happens when you have a decentralized process that people don't even know that they're in it? That usually what makes people up is crisis and pain. So it's kind of like I'm starting to understand my work more as also as like helping people through initiation process that life is throwing at them and they didn't realize. So it's like when you step into a therapist's office and you're like, my marriage has broken down and da-da-da. That's when you finally realize often is like, wait, am I doing my life fucked up? What's this secure attachment thing? Oh my God, I'm a real idiot. Like that's the initiation, but it's pain that you didn't sign up for that's coming to you. Crisis that brings it to you. And the person I was talking to is like, yeah, and you can also experience initiation through just radical curiosity and openness. And kind of an embodied safety that you bring by being in your body and also being really developing a good relationship to death. Because once you develop a really good relationship to death, you can, like even if you say the wrong thing and somebody locks you up, you can just kill yourself. Like there's ways to deal in a way. Like you can become really, really fearless in a way. In some ways, I don't think I'm not saying we should go all to that extreme, but it's like this curiosity and openness opens up, and so we can do that. So we can be radically curious and open, or we can let crisis like fucking hit us on the side of the head. And I think what's happening to a lot of us is it's hitting us on the side of the head, because that's maybe the first step until you realize that you're allowed to also just be radically curious and open and deal with your fear of death. But I think what I'm getting to is like the choose your own adventure. It does feel like there's going to be also just more awareness about initiation processes. That's kind of like what we're talking about almost in our field, I think, is how do you have decentralized open source initiation processes? Don't call it healing anymore. Because healing, there's like this goal that's not kind of like flimsy weird to me at a certain point. It's like, like what is that? Like what the initiation feels like, at least like the tangible next step is like meet all the beings that are in your mimetic ecosystem. And it's really crazy in there. It's crazy in your head. Meet them. It's crazy around you even. Like I don't know if people think about like there's this perfect square or perfect rectangle, 90-degree angles in our head, right? And the fact that my TV looks like that shape, that square might have manifested the TV out of its desire to be present. It's like, oh, well, the best way for me to, this abstract square to be in the world is to become, TV. That's what I mean. We're getting better and better at bringing the abstract beings in our minds into reality. It's like things are getting cleaner and cleaner. The digital world is super clean. You know what I mean? Like super mathematical. So it's like all that stuff is coming out. But like meeting that and being like, oh shit, the rectangle in front of me actually is a being that has an agenda to propagate. And that's kind of like what we're dealing with. People seeing that and then being able to come back and go like, okay, now I'm going to be a decent person, because I think right now I'm going to stop, but I'm curious, like what, I don't know, how we're playing ping pong here.
There's a lot there. I think I'll start with something that both McLuhan and Gebser both talk about, in the sense that Gebser's language is, again, these very cryptic responses or statements he makes about technology, and saying technology is a projection of what is already in us. And so part of the role he thinks in navigating a technocentric world, and he's writing about this in the 50s. Interesting.
Right. It's like pre-internet.
Yeah,
definitely.
But he says like part of the work in finding a new anchor in the present is retracting technology into us. Like, what is technology doing, and what is it an expression of in us, in terms of we're exteriorizing some kind of agency and something that was already in us and in the body. So if we can trace that back into ourselves, like that's part of the work of like navigating a very technocentric world, where we're overwhelmed by this flood of the technocentric, right? Or in our case, artificial intelligence, algorithms, mimetic warfare on the internet. So how do we actually trace that back and retract those intensities into ourselves, or at least trace them, seeing where they came from? sort of but that requires a deep kind of presence. And then the other thing he talks about is just
right,
living
just a
well.
bookmark. Like a lot of
Yeah.
people go that route through the transhumanist route, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's because the intensity of the technological world. It's like, well, let's just put that intensity right in us, which I feel like neutral about. Like I have earbuds in my head, so I'm not like,
Yeah. We're all
but
cyborgs in that
yeah,
sense.
yeah. But that's a different way of looking into oneself than oh, where does this come from in me, in an ancestral origin or something? There's a
Yeah,
different
right.
flavor.
Or the television, the square thing you were talking about, like how do we actually trace this as an exteriorization, right? It's an exteriorization of our consciousness, of our
Yeah.
interior world, and use it as a form of self-knowledge rather than literalizing like, yeah, I want to like, I don't know, plug in some wires and be able to sense the electromagnetic spectrum. Maybe that's a cool thing. I don't know.
I think
But
that is cool, but I also know where it goes wrong if you
right.
don't have both, one hanging out with the other, right? Like
Right,
that's the
exactly.
psychotic break, I think, that we're talking
That
about.
rootedness or that anchoring is what's important. And then part of this as well, like Gebser says, one of the prerequisites for being able to handle the intensity of this integral ontology, this integral world, is concretizing the earlier structures. So reconnecting with them, bringing them back into, as you might say, a somatic relationship in the present. So the magic as it is alive, the mythic, the mental, and how they're all kind of shaping and co-shaping and interrelating dynamically in the present, not abstractly, but concretely, which means for Gebser is like the work for a lot of folks is really getting out of a predominantly overextended mental and growing down, becoming familiar with these different ontologies, and then having a kind of, I use the word equanimity, but maybe like you describe playfulness and openness as like, what if the magic is yeah, here. Okay.
I know what happened there. Yeah, go ahead.
What if we can just dynamically move between these different structures and explore them and play with them, as you say, like rather than have them visited upon us as a catastrophe or a crisis, or like learn about the deficient mental by like being deeply atomized and then like compulsively aggregating in some kind of mimetic war, right? Like compulsively collectivizing in a totally unhealthy way where you learn nothing about the magical and yet you're like drawn to it in a deficient way, like, or you're drawn to like what do you call it, the whole like any kind of the mimetic warfare stuff, or like QAnon and things like that, like drawn to the magic in completely unhealthy ways. Like rather than do that, explore it creatively in the present. So like visit it upon yourself to like and be initiated and explore these different dimensions first, rather than have them visited upon you like from the outside as some kind of crisis.
Right.
So
whoa. Oh my god.
That's so funny with the tech today has been the theme, the intensity. Let's see, I don't hear you at the moment.
Yeah, there's definitely a somebody doesn't like what we're saying vibe or something like that. But I'm gonna well, how are you doing for time? Just checking in for a second. I know we're still recording that.
I do have a chat at 3, so
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, like 15, something like that. Okay, yeah. So something that I'm like kind of like asking myself, is this the moment I want to like unleash this stuff that I've felt like I'm feeling through? And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, Tada, you can kind of go for it. You can repeat yourself a few times, but so something that I think, I mean, this is probably not new, but I think something about contemplative experience, contemplative upper dantian mental experience, and these very high spiritual states we can get into. I've experienced this recently, and I think the ancients have done this too, right? This is through time. Is that they see like these abstract beings, like literally like geometries and stuff.
Mhm.
Like if you go into the Old Testament and look at what angels are, they're like described of like essentially like psychedelic visions of like psychedelic geometric visions. The angels are like rings with eyes on them and stuff. It's like they're not like humanoids even, right?
Yeah.
Or right, like, or Buddhist mandalas or sigils, like all those things. They're highly geometric, and I feel like there was experience that I had that I was like, oh, wait a second, it's like if squares are alive, I'm surrounded by them. Like, wow, I've been a really good, or we have been a really good kind of portal for their agenda. And their agenda could be really simple. It's like a virus. Like a virus doesn't care if they kill or, you know, benefit a person by just doing what they're doing. So there might not be any kind of moral reasoning behind what they're doing, but it is working through us. And one of the things where this is how it connects, but so something when I was having this feeling experience of like, oh shit, shapes are alive. This circle is alive. Oh no. Like our human society is like the perfect kind of like portal for these beings that are very simple and mimetic to come through us, and our whole lives are, you know, I have a record player, there's a spinning circle on it, I love it, this will connect back. But what I've felt like I really tapped into and seeing how different cultures use geometric patterns in their culture really relates to how they move that abstraction into their body, how they manage it. So the dances and the shape and the patterns, the kind of like even this kind of pattern behind me, this is like super like psychedelic vision, right? Like you see that like stuff, but like also stuff like this, like on my cup, which is, I don't know. Yeah, like that this kind of geometry stuff that's going on. I don't know. If you're not on the YouTube, you can't see this, but you see that like in cultures that are more earthy, the geometries get less clean. Mm-hmm. But it's like there are ways in which we I don't know how the relationship is exactly, but there's a way in which we can interface with information. Because the fact that people see this kind of vision when they're in these heightened spiritual states, it means that it's always there too. We're just not registering. It's always there and consciously influencing us. Actually, it's hanging out always there. We just see it when we're in a different state. Mm-hmm. So when we go through initiation processes, people are prepared for that through dance and other means, right? The nervous system regulation and daily toning is a part of a lot of tribal societies. It's a daily process. It's not like us. It's like that's like foundational to their life. And I think this is a big part of how humans have, when you're talking about the concretization of the past, I think about that, this like understanding that like the somatic methodologies are ways in which our ancestors and throughout our culture actually have been dealing with our relationship to information that's coming through us. And the more and more abstract we get and lose sense of the body mind, the more the information just gets to come through us unfiltered without our agenda participating. So this is what I call spirit or mimetic possession, is that where we don't have agency over the information coming through us. We're not channeling anymore. We're actually possessed. Because if it's your channel, you can turn it on and off. But if you're possessed, you can't. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense, right? So I think, and where I go to, and like this comes back to the spinning black disc, is like, you know, for example, then you think about jazz. Jazz is a concretization of the future, past, and the present right together. It's a synthesis of these ancestral rhythms of the past, you know, that were lost through diaspora and reconnecting, or disrupted through diaspora. And then like the present moment and the contemporary moment of music and like instruments that are around. But the aesthetic is actually very future. I don't know. So I think this thing about the diaphanous and jazz being diaphanous, and diaphanity is one way to describe it, like without really abstract terms, is like a jazzy way of thinking, a jazzy way of being, a jazzy way of sensing, emoting, and thinking. Yeah. So that's kind of what you're like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that we came back, or because we kind of started talking about jazz. It's like primary metaphor to talk about, you know, integrality and diaphaneity, and that we're kind of coming back to that.
Yeah.
But in a way that I really appreciate how you unpacked it about the kind of the lost or destroyed diaspora knowledge and way of being kind of brought into the, like, discovered in the present, in that kind of creative open present where the past and the present and the future all kind of mingle. But as you say, the aesthetic is this future oriented aesthetic, in the sense that it does feel very novel and
Right.
I don't know, allowing the future to also be playing creatively in the present. And that's the attitude. I mean, that's really the attitude, the sense of playful openness, where the past is playful openness that allows the past to play with the future in the present. I mean, that's what it comes down to. How do we embody that somatically? I think jazz is a great example. I think there are many different techniques that, like, Cynthia Bourgeot is exploring, and my group is exploring as well, and, like, in terms of how do we allow everything to kind of play in the present? Because I, like, as you said, like, I think that's really the only way to adequately prepare for what's going on right now in this so-called axial period or crisis period, is to begin to kind of take that playfulness on ourselves and, like, do this ourselves, because that's really the only way to, like, get ahead of what is happening outside of us in the exterior, in terms of the larger culture and the crisis that's going on. We ought to be already living in the future and jazzing,
Yeah,
in order to
totally.
engage with that, right?
Yeah, and actually one of the things that I find I've been wondering and thinking about, and a lot of my work stemmed from like working with, you know, white folks around their ancestral trauma. That's kind of like how my career kind of nascently started out. But I've thought a lot about, like, so if you take a dance practice, the foundational thing that you learn is the isolation of the three dantians. It's foundational. You learn to isolate your neck, your heart, and your hips. Like, those are the three centers that you learn in. And the weird thing is, when you isolate, that actually means you're actually in a way of being that your thoughts, emotions, and sensations are actually distinct and disconnected from each other. But actually, weirdly, that actually brings about this playful relationship of all three.
Mm-hmm.
And the pelvis is actually, generally speaking, the place where, like, it's the center point of our body. So it's like the gut is foundational to me, because if your gut is constricted, the playfulness kind of doesn't reach all the way to the ground, if that makes sense, because it's the main pivotal pivot in our body, right? And it's literally the center of gravity. But so there's something really interesting I've been thinking about, is like, how do you get people to think better? And part of my answer is like, well, you would actually almost need to teach them to be able to separate and move their different brains, like literally in space, in a very material sense. But at the same time, being able to do that doesn't always mean that you can do the thing that I'm looking at. So I'm trying to figure this out. But there's a part of me that's joking around. It's like, maybe, you know, as something like, what, you know, like, what would, I have been thinking about this, like, what would, like, in your language, mean, what would, like, an integral hip hop class look like? Because it is the thing that's happening. If you learn how to move your three centers and your spine essentially in a way that's connected, yet not enmeshed, yet very musical, and it's diaphanous in the sense that, like, an entire movement can, like, create a relation. I don't know if you're just in the audio, you can't see it, but like your neck and your heart moving, like, kind of like in opposite directions in circles, that's related to each other, but doing totally opposite things. And that is actually visually diaphanous, in a sense of, like, you're like when you see people do that kind of stuff, you're like, well, what is happening? Because there's multiple areas of focus moving in at once, but it's all integrated into each other, and you're like, what the fuck? Like, that's what the miraculousness of dance is, right? When it's fully expressed in its kind of animist, kind of improvised essence. And I really think it's like, there's no real, I think, like, I've been dealing with, there's no real shortcut around that in many ways. Even though it doesn't guarantee a certain result, there's also no shortcut around that kind of basic somatic work.
Hmm.
And I've been wondering about that's relationship to like um the philosophical and the contemplative. Like what I feel like that's kind of like where we're meeting today too, from worlds too
Yeah.
a little bit, is like, so yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there. Like I have been long thinking about like what are the practices that bring people into being able to be more diaphanous or paradoxical, and it's
Hmm.
like at a certain point it's like it has to usually happen inside of the body before it manifests somewhere. And again, like when we talked about our ancestry, it's like I think it does make a difference that, you know, like you have like black and indigenous ancestry, so you have this like ancestral genetic memories in your body of your nervous system is you know, is like racially culturally formed in a certain way, so when it receives information it doesn't process it the same way as people who might have a different orientation as you somatically, like ingrained in your body.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think what's interesting is in my own class and working with Gebser and integral phenomenology is I've kind of come to the same need for that. The thing you're describing, right?
Mm.
In my own language, like something I talked with Dare about is the
Oh yeah.
Calabi-Yau, the Calabi-Yau image. I don't know if you're familiar with that image, but Dare has been speaking about it a little bit.
Mm.
Um, it's essentially like I don't even know. I don't understand the mathematics behind it, but it was developed, I think, in string theory and in quantum mechanics to describe like fifth dimension or something. But the image is what I like because the image it's taking the torus
Uh-huh.
but adding all of these different folds, and it looks like this thing which is manifolds. It has manifolds and it's moving inside and outside. Interior is becoming exterior, flowing into all its different topologies. And this
How do you
sense
spell
of
this?
uh, let's see, it's I'm gonna just type it out because my hands remember it. Calabi-Yau. So Calabi hyphen uh, Yau. Calabi-Yau manifold. And so yeah, it's this really hyperdimensional looking image. But when people ask me like, well, how do all the structures work together? And like, what does Gebser mean by their interrelationships? What does Gebser mean by past, present, and future as this dynamic living whole? I always point to that image as this very um, psychoactive kind of image. But
Oh
in
yeah, yeah, it's
terms
very crazy. Yeah. Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh.
in terms of our practice though, it's like, well, yeah, when you're talking about the three centers and like really defining the head, really defining the center, and the pelvis, it's like playing around with the different structures so that they begin to play and interrelate with each other, right? Concretizing the magic. Okay, what are practices for that? There's temporic practices, there's somatic practices, and I don't think they're really distinguished from each other, but in the sense of like emphasizing, like paying attention to different forms of temporics or working with the gut. There's like heart-centered practices. There's um, imagistic and psychistic oriented practices working with myth and the psyche, and like the goal is not to just do any one of them, but really kind of be playfully, as you're saying, like, okay, what if you move them in a different way this way with each other? So, like, oscillating back and forth between different orientations, what emerges in that play seems to be this field or this sense of the whole, or the relationship between all of them, right? When in the performance, in the jazz, in the dancing, or in the movement between. And that's the kind of graceful moment that I think we can't be forced, which is the sense of the whole being. But it in practice it looks like moving and oscillating and exploring and playfully kind of let me deliberately playfully create, you know, a gut oriented experience or a mythical oriented experience, and then also playfully intentionally drop it and like move into the mental and the abstract and the directive and the purposive and see how that relates. The idea is to like develop a kind of plasticity, which can cultivate the sense of openness and movement. How that looks, I think, is very contingent upon like where we're coming from and what our practices are. But I do think, as you're saying, like it has to do with somatics. It has to be, in my language, like aesthetic, present oriented, and in Gebser's language, concretized. So that means like really engaged with, not just abstractly. So can't just be head centered practices. They have to be like one of the things that's come up in my community is like gardening, which has become like a really, really good way to kind of ground a sense of a time that does not divide the day. And I'm quoting an author I can't remember at the moment.
I love it.
But really kind of exploring that sense of temporics and working with the non-human plant world and its own sense of growing, the different interrelationships that are like present in gardening with bugs and birds and everything else, right? The different state of consciousness. So a lot of us are exploring that, like different ways to become present, not to be as directive and progressive oriented in terms of our schedules, which is hard to do, obviously. Like I think you're saying we've exteriorized a form of time and a form of consciousness, which is very atomizing and um, anxiety inducing in terms of like, okay, are we being more productive today? Like it's so hard to decolonize that mode of thinking. Um, how can we deliberately do that then? How can we create intentional time to explore these different modalities that constitute us, right? So plasticity, presence, concretization for me are starting points. I don't have any of the answers, but at least those are the orienting themes that seem to be coming up again and again in my community.
Like what's interesting to me when I hear you talk and I watch this image, I think we've had a really mimetically interesting conversation because I think we're speaking pretty intellectually, but also it's actually what we're talking about is a lot like dancing. There's something underneath that is actually what we're riding on a little bit. I can feel it. And because when I see this Calabi-Yau Manifold image and you started talking about the gardening, it's like this lack of centerness in this Calabi-Yau Manifold. Like it's actually hard to kind of like locate, like where is this? Like even when you look at it, it like scrambles your brain a bit. I think if people are on the internet, they can go and Google it. It's Calabi-Yau manifold. And it's like when you look at this and contemplate it, you actually are in that state of like, right, you're growing a garden, it has a rhythm, and then it has insects and has all this other shit that happens out of nowhere all the time that um like you can't deal with. This is just how life is. And actually for me it actually goes back to because I think something interesting, because we've been talking about centers, right? And then for me, like gut is the center that is the center of human that we have agency over, that we can work on. That gut center also turns into maybe it's like the essence of the toroidal shape is like no center. So it's like wuxian. So there you find center, and then the next step after that is that there's no center anymore. You're like, oh, there's no sense of centeredness even. And I feel it's interesting because I feel when I see this image, it makes me think of that, because even actually, gardening and dealing with all these entities always just fucking flying around and, ruining your shit and dealing with that, which is like life. This is like Wuxian, there is no center. Because I think a lot of the times we keep trying to reorient things so that there is a center. And that is like becomes this like kind of constructive thing. I'm speaking very aesthetically in a sense. Like I'm not like, this is not even a rational thing I'm saying. I think it's a sensibility for there not being a center. There's like,
For us though, the center, which isn't really a center, which helps anchor us, is becoming present. Like really, the presence is the only way to hold all of that going on.
Absolutely,
not in a conceptual way, but as you're saying, in an aesthetic, felt sense way, and somatic, like the gut's sort of like in that, but being able to come back to the present is the only way to really kind of get into the flow of that Calabi-Yau of gardening, all the different agencies that are interacting and in communication and cross-talking, becoming present. And then, okay, we want to move into abstraction or move into another thing, but then become present again, right? So it's that presence which is able to maybe hold all of that together, or doesn't need to hold it, right? But it's in our capacity to become present. And this is interesting, like Gebser talks about this is in the context of like religion. He says, religio is this sort of binding back to observe the mysteries, to like kind of work with paradoxical thinking and go like, okay, there are things which reason doesn't understand, and to observe that, sure. But then with his integral turn, he talks about preligio, or preligion, as this capacity to not be obligated to the past, right? To bind back to mystery, but actually to be obligated to the present, right? So it's this like presence oriented, which isn't exactly the same as centering, but we can,
No.
as you're saying, like you kind of start with it as a kind of, okay, we'll go to the gut
Right.
or become present, but it really opens up into this, there is no center, or the center is everywhere.
Yes.
So
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. There is no center because every cell in my body has a center, and that has a center, and that has a center. So when you're in there, when you're in it as a flow state, there's no, it's like wuxin. Yeah.
Yeah. But the way in is becoming present, you know?
Yes. Yeah. The way it
Kind of
is.
anchor.
Yeah. Uh-huh. I think we're about at time, and I actually feel like this would be a really nice time. I like to maybe, I would love to do the wuxin thing, and like, I'm curious, like, what are you doing later today? If you don't mind. I feel like it'd be just nice to share like what we're like, because I feel like we had a really abstract conversation in some ways, and it might be nice to just share like what's going on with your day today in the most banal ways.
Oh, well, I'm going to be doing some gardening probably.
Right.
There are some plants I'm trying to there's some native Florida plants that I'm in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Okay.
And I've been rewilding the backyard, which means mostly like not cutting the grass, allowing wildflowers to grow everywhere, and then watching what happens, and really just like showing up and watching what happens. And now I've started to introduce some wildflowers here, which are really good for some local pollinator insects. And so part of that process is also like learning what the plant wants and where it wants to be in the light and where it wants to be in the soil. So I'm working with some plants to figure out that with them. So
Awesome.
that's what I'll be doing this afternoon. And then I'm gonna be on another call. I'm gonna be on calls tonight. So I'm gonna be on Zoom.
Okay.
For better or worse.
Yeah.
But yeah. This has been great. Very much enjoyed our conversation. Like you said, like it felt intellectual, but also like jazzing or sparring, or like there's a playfulness underneath.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, that's a survive. I mean, if I can I finish off by sharing my day a little bit?
Sure,
like, my turn's not up done yet. So it's funny because I think I'm gonna go to the record store and look for jazz. I got a record player a week ago, and I've been really like appreciating it. I've been a very mobile person and haven't been able to settle into a place. So buying records is like really a bad idea because that shit's fucking heavy as hell. But I've been really like feeling it, and it's so different to listen off wax. So that's been really cool. And then I think I'm seeing a client, and then having a conversation with somebody who's quote unquote old student apprentice of mine, and then quote unquote, because who am I, right? But and then I don't know, in the evening it's probably listen to this and see if it's worth releasing. Well, so listen to some jazz, listening to our jazz and see how it goes. And thank you so much, Jeremy. I know we've like taken a lot of time, but it's like I don't know, it's like a Fela Kuti album. It's like 45-minute songs. That's kind of how I roll sometimes. So
there you go.
But yeah, thank you so much. And bye listeners. Thank you.
Bye everybody.
Bye everybody.